Okay, we're starting back on the cardiovascular system, and geez, it seems like we have been here 10 times. We did it again tonight in the lab, right? The cardiovascular system, the blood vessels. There are three types of blood vessels: arteries, capillaries, and veins. We name arteries because they take blood away from the heart. The capillaries are the site of material exchange. Veins take blood towards the heart. The vessels have tunics or layers. Tunica intima is the inside layer, the endothelium. It is simple squamous epithelium. Tunica media is the muscle layer, smooth muscles arranged in a circular arrangements with elastin, sheets of elastin in there. Tunica media is regulated by vasomotor nerves from the sympathetic nervous system. Vasoconstriction is when the muscles are contracted. Vasodilation is when the muscles are relaxed. Vasodilation, the muscles are relaxed. Then tunica externa, if you're using an older text, we called it tunica adventitia, the connective tissue that anchors those vessels and holds them in place. The central canal of the vessels is called the lumen. The central opening is the lumen. We looked at our arterial side first. We began with the big ones, the elastic arteries, the aorta and its major branches. As we move down, they get smaller. The muscular arteries are the distributing arteries. They deliver blood to the specific body organs. Most of the muscular arteries are the ones that we see that are named arteries. They are smaller in diameter, but they have the thickest tunica media. The arterioles are the smallest of the arteries. They begin to lose tunica media as they get smaller and smaller. From the arteries, the small arteries, we go into the capillaries, the site of material exchange between the interstitial fluid and the blood. They are the smallest of the capillaries. They only have one layer, one tunic, simple squamous epithelium. Remember those fried eggs, simple squamous epithelium? And so those simple squamous epithelial cells have intercellular clefts, openings, and that's how that material exchange occurs, by simple diffusion across that simple squamous epithelial layer. And we see capillaries everywhere there is blood. It's how we get the nutrients into our tissues. There are types of capillaries: continuous, fenestrated, sinusoidal capillaries, and then we had a little discussion on capillary beds. Remember, it had a thoroughfare channel, and there was about 100 different little capillaries that branched out into the things. After the capillaries, we go into the venous system. The venous side brings blood towards the heart. The veins are larger than the arteries. Veins hold 65% of our blood volume. The veins become reservoirs. A varicose vein, a vein that has become tortuous, bent all out of shape, and dilated, usually comes from incompetent valves in the veins. And a vascular anastomosis is when a tissue either gets blood from or blood picked up by more than one vessel. Some terms we talked about when we went to physiology of circulation. Blood flow is the blood that's flowing through a specific area in a given amount of time. Blood flow given to us by the heart. Blood pressure is the force per unit area exerted on the walls of the vessels that the blood is in, measured by a sphygmomanometer and expressed in millimeters Hg. Blood pressure. Blood pressure is a result of resistance to the flow. Resistance is the measure or amount of friction that the blood encounters as it passes through the vessels. Most of the friction is encountered in the systemic system of the peripheral vessels. There were sources of resistance: blood viscosity, length of the blood vessel, and the blood vessel diameter. Your discussion question is to discuss the way resistance affects pressure and the sources of that resistance. Remember, we talked about blood viscosity, blood vessel length, and blood vessel diameter. If you increase viscosity, you increase resistance, you increase blood pressure. If you decrease viscosity, you decrease resistance, you decrease blood pressure. If you increase length, you increase resistance, you increase pressure. If you decrease length, you decrease resistance, you decrease pressure. Diameter. If you increase diameter, you decrease resistance, so you decrease pressure. If you decrease diameter, you increase resistance, so you increase blood pressure. Resistance increases pressure. It goes up, more pressure; it goes down, less pressure. Resistance. It's a relationship between blood flow, pressure, and resistance. We looked at systemic blood pressure, and everybody tried to figure out how to take a blood pressure. Blood flows along a pressure gradient. The heart generates the flow. The pressure comes from resistance to the flow. Systolic pressure and diastolic pressure. Systolic pressure, the high one; diastolic, the low one. Pulse pressure is the difference between the two. Mean arterial pressure, we calculate. Mean arterial pressure is 1/3 of pulse pressure added to diastolic. 1/3 of pulse added to diastolic. Mean arterial pressure is the pressure that propels the blood through the system. We looked at capillary pressure. Remember, we drew our capillary bed up here, and we had 40 millibars of arterial blood flowing into our capillary bed, and we had 20 millibars of pressure coming out of our capillary bed. And remember, we said that we blow more plasma out on this end than we picked up on that end, and we picked it up down there with osmotic or oncotic pressure rather than blood pressure. Remember that? And so we left more out in the tissue space than we picked up, and we picked that extra plasma or interstitial fluid up, and it became plasma. There were some factors that helped us return that venous blood back up to the heart. Veins had valves, and valves prevent backflow. The respiratory pump, diaphragm goes up and down, sucks that blood back towards the heart. And then the muscular pump, as we contract skeletal muscle, it squeezes or milks that blood up those vessels, and it goes up and can't get back down because the valve won't let it go backwards. Make sense? Valves prevent backflow, respiratory pump, and muscular pump. There were some ways that we talked about to maintain blood pressure. The three main factors in controlling our blood pressure: cardiac output, peripheral resistance, and blood volume. We looked at some short-term mechanisms to control blood pressure. The role of the vasomotor centers. So there was some neural involvement from the medulla oblongata. There were some chemo-initiated reflexes and some baro-initiated reflexes. The short-term mechanisms for controlling blood pressure basically were chemical controls. The adrenal medulla and its hormones, atrial natriuretic peptide from the heart and its effect. Atrial natriuretic peptide, remember that guy? Atrial natriuretic peptide produced in the walls of the atria during times of stretch does not affect the heart, goes to the kidney, blocks the formation of renin. Renin pulls salt back in from the renal tubules. No renin, no salt pull in. No salt pull in becomes a diuretic. We pee more water. Plasma, 90% water. So we drop our blood volume. We looked at those short-term mechanisms, AMP. The long-term mechanisms in regulating our blood pressure were renal problems. The kidney regulates our blood pressure long-term. We talked about monitoring circulatory efficiency and the pulse points. The pulse points were, we touched superficial arteries. We don't get pulses from veins. The most common places were the radial, the temporal, the facial, the carotids, the brachial, the femoral, the popliteal, the posterior tibial, and the dorsiped. Blood pressure. We use a sphygmomanometer to take our blood pressure. Alterations in our blood pressure. Hypotension, lower blood pressure. 100/60 or less, low blood pressure. There was a type of low blood pressure called orthostatic hypotension. It was temporary low blood pressure that causes dizziness. When standing suddenly, the blood pools up in the lower limbs and the sympathetic nervous system cannot respond fast enough. That was the guy we talked about that squatted on the sideline and watched the kid play soccer. When he stood up, he did this for a few seconds. Orthostatic hypotension. Then there was hypertension. Hypertension, 140/90 or higher. There were some symptoms or some associated, some contributing things. Diet, obesity, age, race, heredity, stress, smoking, wild women, fast cars, all those fun things. But those are not the guys, right? Those are contributing factors. There's two types of hypertension. Primary hypertension, that we don't know the cause, so we just treat the symptoms. Take these pills, brings your pressure down. Secondary hypertension. Secondary hypertension is linked to some underlying condition. To treat secondary hypertension, we treat the primary disease to bring the pressure down. We talked about blood perfusion and how the blood flows through the body tissues. There were some auto-regulatory mechanisms. And remember, we learned to calculate mean arterial pressure? And the reason we did that was because the auto-regulatory mechanisms do not affect the mean arterial pressure. Systemic circulation remains constant. We talked about blood flow to special areas, and that was kind of crazy. We kind of blew that off a little bit because everybody knows that different parts of the body need different amounts of blood at different times. Hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure was the force that's exerted by the fluid pushing out against the capillary walls. Osmotic pressure was brought on by the change of concentration between the water and the large cells and proteins. So if we blew water out, we changed that composition. So we had osmosis or osmotic pressure. Circulatory shock. Circulatory shock. Any condition in which the blood vessels are not filled. If the blood vessels are not filled, the heart can't pump the blood. If we lose 1/3, about 30% of our blood volume, then the heart can't send the blood out through the system. Hypovolemic shock, the most common type. Hypovolemic, the bleeder. The guy's lost blood, so his blood volume is going down. The second one, vascular shock, and we talked about that again tonight. Septicemia, those toxins build up in the blood, and it reaches a certain point where all of the vessels dilate, but the volume of blood remains the same, so we are not filled. So vascular shock, septicemia, is almost the same as hypovolume, but it's brought on by it's not brought on by the blood volume itself, but by the diameter of the vessels. Changes it, vascular shock. And then there was cardiogenic shock, where the heart doesn't work, the myocardial infarct.